Hey Bio 150 folks. So we're going to pick up where we left off talking about how different organisms regulate their water content in different types of habitats. So at this point, we've talked about unicellular taxa, we've talked about simple multicellular taxa, and the different adaptations that these different groups have to deal with different habitat types. What we're going to talk about now is start moving into the complex multicellular taxa. And in these next few lectures, we'll be talking about plants. So plants are hyper diverse and hyper interesting in terms of the habitats where they can survive and the different growth forms. So everything from the largest plant or the largest flowering plant that we see in the world to these crazy cordones cacti that live in Mexico to these weird baobab trees that we can find in Africa. And you can see me hanging out in this tree. There's huge diversity that we see in the world of plants. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about in general why we should care about plants, what exactly a plant is, and then we'll get into the adaptations that allow plants to regulate water. So I would argue that you should care about plants just because they're really, really cool. This is one great example of a neat plant that's called a strangler fig. Basically what the strangler fig does is it lands on another tree. So this sort of set of roots here is the strangler fig, and this other tree on the inside is a different species of tree. And it'll basically grow all over the top of that tree that's on the inside and strangle it out and eventually kill that other tree. And that tree, once that tree on the inside dies, it'll rot away, and then you'll be left with this sort of hollow tree that you can climb up the middle of. And here you can see, this is a picture that I took of a student that I worked with in Costa Rica, where we would climb up the inside of these strangler figs to do research on them. So this is the middle of that tree after the inside tree dies out. And you can see another strangler fig growing all over these buildings. Super neat trees, but let's say that you don't really care about trees that much. You're not a tree hugger like I am. Well, let's talk about some more practical reasons why you should care about plants. Are you breathing? Well, you can thank a tree for that. So trees, of course, do photosynthesis. As part of that process of photosynthesis, they produce oxygen. Oxygen, obviously, we need that to breathe. And on top of that, trees also eat our CO2. So the second part of that photosynthesis process is trees will take CO2 out of the environment and incorporate it into their biomass. So they're pulling CO2, a potentially dangerous greenhouse gas, out of the air. And so you can thank trees for doing those two things through photosynthesis. If that's not enough, trees are also vital, or plants are vital staple crops for us. So whether you're talking about the wheat that makes up our bread and cereals, or the corn that makes up a lot of the other sort of tortillas and other products that we work on, these are base staple crops that form the bottom of the food chain for all the other organisms on life that need to survive. So extremely important part of the food chain. And on top of just being basic staple crops, they also form some really important crops for some of the fun products that we might even consume. And so take a minute here and guess what you think these 1, 2, 3, 4 different plants are. What sort of basic products these 4 plants are. So these pink berries here, these are actually coffee berries before they get roasted. These sort of Nerf football looking things, and they are about the size, these pods are about the size of a Nerf football. These are chocolate pods. This, what you're looking at back here, this is a giant grass, and that is in fact sugarcane. And these little buds that you're looking at here, these are hops that we use to make beer. And interestingly enough, hops and marijuana are in the same plant family, Cannabaceae. So it's pretty interesting that one family forms some of the major recreational drugs that are used in the US. So once again, another reason to care about plants in general. So with that in mind, let's talk about what plants are, the actual kingdom Plantae. Okay, so remember, kingdom is just under a domain in terms of the sort of taxonomic level that we're talking about. And so you can see here, these are the 1, 2, and then this is the third major domain, the eukaryotes. So bacteria is one domain, archaea is another domain, and then all 3 of these sort of groups form the eukaryotes. And these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 super kingdoms that we had talked about that form the eukaryotes. And then one of these sort of kingdoms within that is the Plantae. Okay? And so Plantae, by definition, they are a monophyletic group. And they are also by definition eukaryotes. So everything basically from this common ancestor down, these are all eukaryotes. All members of this kingdom Plantae, they are all photosynthetic, so they have chloroplasts that allow them to do photosynthesis. All members of this group also have cell walls. And another aspect is that individuals can't really move in the sense that a tree on its own, if you were to go and sort of like stab it or manipulate or something like that, it's not going to run away like an animal might. And so the group that we're going to spend most of our time talking about are the green plants and the land plants. So green algae and the land plants form this group called the green plants. And within that, there's this group called the land plants. And so these are the two groups that we're going to be talking about today. So let's talk about when land plants evolved. So this figure should look relatively familiar to you. This is basically just a deep geological history of life on Earth, and this is that same sort of deep geological history condensed into a 30-day calendar with Earth forming on the last day and present day, or on the first day and the present day being today. And you can see that on this calendar, it's about the 27th day, so pretty late in the game that land plants come onto the scene. And if you put that in the sort of context of the evolution of life, you have prokaryotes, the first life coming on 3.5 billion years ago, eukaryotes coming onto the scene about 2 billion years ago, complex multicellularity evolving about 550 million years ago, and then about 480 million years ago, we see the first fossil land plants. And estimates range from up to 700 million years ago, but we think about 480 million years ago is when the first land plants appeared. So the first complex multicellular plants that we're seeing on land. Okay, which statement is false? All right, if you said C, you are correct. This is a false statement. Land plants are a monophyletic group. All of those other statements are true, and you can see the reasons for that in the previous slides. Which plant groups are we going to explore? So we're going to talk about these major groups. The green algae, and then in orange, these different groups represent something called bryophytes, and then in purple, these represent different groups called the vascular plants. And all of these groups can be condensed into what's called the land plants. So the bryophytes, a great example of bryophytes are mosses, so you should become familiar with this term bryophytes and try to get that mental image that a bryophyte is a moss. Ferns and allies, if you can think of a fern and sort of get that in your head, just remember that's another particular plant group that we're interested in. This group called the gymnosperms that we see right here on this tree. So the gymnosperms are pine trees, conifers, anything with a pine cone. That's an example of a gymnosperm. So once again, try to get that mental image when you hear the word gymnosperm, sort of thinking of a pine tree. And then this last group here, the angiosperms. So the angiosperms are any fruiting or flowering plant. So these are probably the most typical plants that we think of. So anything that produces a fruit or a flower is considered an angiosperm. And once again, try to get that mental image of any time something, or we talk about an angiosperm, we're talking about a fruiting or flowering plant. And these bryophytes, these are considered to be non-vascular plants, meaning they don't have vascular tissue. So things like xylem and phloem, we'll talk a little bit more about what that is and what that means. And then these vascular plants, or all these three other groups, are considered to be vascular plants. In other words, they have a system of tubes for bulk flow, like xylem and phloem. And once again, we'll talk about this in more detail in future slides. So try to have all of these terms straight in your head. Okay, which statement is incorrect? Which one's false? All right, if you said ferns and allies are non-vascular plants, that is the false statement. Those are, in fact, vascular plants. They have vasculature. The rest of these statements are true, and that's explained in the previous slides. So let's talk about some plant adaptations that exist to regulate water. And the important thing to sort of note here is plants, because they can't move, they have to be able to osmoregulate, so they need to be able to sort of regulate the amount of water they're exposed to and the amount of water they lose and the sort of salts that are in them and everything like that without being able to move. So they don't have the same sort of advantages that animals have that, you know, if you're overheating or you're thirsty or you're losing too many salts or you're losing too much water, you can just move into a cooler spot or you can just move to a spot where there's water to try to cool off or try to get water. Plants can't do that, so they have to have different ways of dealing with the sort of pressures of osmoregulation and maintaining a good water and salt balance. And these are the major adaptations that we'll be covering. So we'll be talking about cell walls, we'll be talking about vacuoles, we'll be talking about a cuticle, we'll be talking about stomata, we'll be talking about vascular tissue, and we'll be talking about some other specific structural adaptations that plants have to be able to regulate their water and salt content and osmoregulate. So first, let's talk about cell walls and vacuoles. And if you were to put cell walls and vacuoles, so remember these are specific traits that plants have evolved. If you were to put these traits onto the sort of phylogenetic tree of these different groups of plants, you'd see that these are the most ancestral trait that's shared by all green plants. So all these green plants have vacuoles and they have cell walls. So this is a very ancestral trait that's shared by plants for water regulation. So plant cells have cell walls, and those cell walls are important for maintaining turgor pressure and osmoregulation. So remember, a cell wall is something that's distinct from a cell membrane. So here we've got a sort of rigid cell wall. These cell walls are composed of cellulose in plants, and they surround a cell membrane. That's, remember, this sort of lipid plasmid, lipid bilayer that surrounds a cell. And so remember, there's a distinction between a cell wall versus a cell membrane, and these cell walls and cell membranes combine to help maintain turgor or turgor pressure that keep a plant from wilting. So you can think of a sort of sad, wilted plant. This is a plant that does not have a lot of turgor. And basically, plant cells, they need to be hypertonic relative to their surroundings. So remember, hypertonic means that there's more salts inside of the plant cells than there is outside of them. So the outside is hypotonic, the inside of the cell is hypertonic. And they can create this hypertonic environment by pumping solutes or salts into the cells. And by maintaining that hypertonic environment, basically it means water by osmosis is going to have a net movement into those cells. So when water moves into those cells, it causes the cell to expand. And when it expands, it basically increases this turgor pressure against the cell wall. So we talked about this in fungi. Plants do something similar, creates this turgor pressure, and that basically makes the plant become less wilty and blow up. And that's what you think of when you think of a sort of healthy plant. So this is a plant with low turgor pressure. It's all wilted and sort of flopping over. It doesn't have enough water in it. And here's a basal plant that's got high turgor pressure. And so this is a well-watered plant, high turgor pressure. It's standing up straight and stiff. And this is what you sort of think of when you think of a healthy plant. And this is often what an image you might have in your head if you think of an unhealthy plant. So it's important to maintain turgor pressure, and osmoregulation is a big part of that. And part of the way that plants osmoregulate and maintain this turgor pressure is the use of something called a vacuole. And so a vacuole is just a membrane-enclosed fluid-filled sac that occupies anywhere from 30 to 90% of a plant cell by volume. So a huge percentage of a plant cell is taken up by this thing called a vacuole. And this vacuole plays a very important role in maintaining that turgor pressure. And so here you can see a plant cell. Here's the cell wall. And then this membrane-enclosed fluid-filled sac, this is a vacuole here. And you can see it's taking up a very large percentage of the plant cell. And basically, the vacuole plays two critical roles. Number one, it contributes to the rigidity of the plant cell by generating turgor pressure. And it also assists in growth of the plant, so that maintaining that turgor pressure is necessary to make the cells grow and elongate. And so it plays a role in maintaining turgor pressure, and that turgor pressure in turn plays a role in helping with plant growth and cell elongation. And you can imagine how this vacuole is going to look according to different osmotic environments. So for example, if you put a plant cell into a hypertonic environment where there's more salts outside the cell than inside the cell, water is going to move by osmosis out of the cell, and that vacuole is going to shrink way down. And so this is a plasmolized, what's called a plasmolized cell. Whereas in an isotonic environment, there's going to be about an even movement of water into and out of the cell. And so the vacuole is going to have some water in it, but it's going to be a little bit flaccid. And in a hypotonic environment, so a hypotonic environment, remember there's less or fewer solutes in the environment, relative to the plant cell. There's going to be a net movement of water into the vacuole. The vacuole is going to blow up real fat. It's going to push real hard against the cell wall, or the inner cell. Plant cell is going to push real hard against the cell walls, and you're going to have a big turgid environment with a lot of turgor pressure. And so in these environments, the plants might look something like this, where in a hypertonic environment, the plant is just going to die because it's just shrunken down so small. In an isotonic environment, a plant might be able to survive for a little while, but it's going to be very wilted. In a hypotonic environment where there's lots of water around, it's going to be nice and turgid, okay? And this is one reason why plants really don't do well in super salty environments. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but they have to invest a ton of energy in maintaining this sort of turgor pressure and maintaining or being able to survive in those saltier environments. Okay, which statement is correct? If you said fungi and plants will typically do best in a hypotonic environment because this helps us generate turgor pressure, that is the correct answer. If this is not making sense to you, why? Please review the previous slide. So we've just talked about plant adaptations to regulate water. We've talked about cell walls, and we've talked about vacuoles. Okay, so in the next sort of set of slides, in the next little set of lectures, we're going to move on to talk about this next group of adaptations, specifically a cuticle and stomata. So we'll talk about what those are in the next lecture.